Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Campos Mello. I'm a reporter at large at Folha de São Paulo and a research scholar at Columbia University. Today, I'm going to be moderating the panel Elections in the Age of Revolt, Brazil, Colombia, and Chile. And to discuss the political challenges in the region, we have the honor to have here Clifford Young, who's the president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the United States and leads Ipsos Global Election and Political Polling Risk Practice. Christopher Garman, Eurasia's Managing Director for the Americas, and Maria Luisa Puig, Eurasia's Group Director for Latin America. And I just wanted to remind you that you in the audience, you can send the questions to the chat box. So, really happy to be here. Looking forward to listening to your thoughts. And I would like to start by asking each one of you to talk for approximately 5 minutes about the political scenario in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia next year. Let's start with Maria Luisa.
Thank you, Patricia, and pleasure to be here. Well, so I would say that I cover in Eurasia Group Chile, Colombia, and Peru, and these three countries have either experienced or are about to experience presidential elections that have been quite polarizing and pretty uncertain. So I'll start with Chile, which is the country that has the most imminent election coming on the 19th of December. And in here, the presidential race has largely been driven by public discontent that actually preceded the pandemic, which is something that we have also seen in our countries in the region. We saw that evident in massive demonstrations that erupted in 2019. We have seen that quite evident in recent elections. So for instance, a plebiscite on whether to replace the constitution, who should be in charge of drafting the new constitution, the elections for the members of the constituent convention, in which leftists and independents did very well, and also in the low approval ratings of the incumbent, in this case of President Sebastián Piñera, despite the fact that Chile has done relatively well or quite well in terms of its vaccination and that the fiscal response to the pandemic has been massive. Moderate options were not that appealing in this context, and as expected, we are going to see a runoff between leftist Gabriel Boric and right-wing José Antonio Caz on the 19th of December. Boric has a slight edge, but the election will be competitive and voter preferences can still change. There is a large share of undecided voters that would migrate to Boric or cast or could abstain. Therefore, turnout is going to be key for the final results. There is also a large degree of uncertainty about the transfer of votes from the candidates that didn't make it to the runoff. Boric has so far seemed to be benefiting the most, but then again, there are many undecided voters, and that includes those who voted, for instance, for Patricia in the first round, who ended up in third place. And then talking more specifically about the issues and the campaign platform, I would say that Boric's campaign platform appeals to those demanding more public spending and social equality, something that we have seen echoed in the street protests, in recent elections. But in the case of Caz, he's not only tapping into conservative voters, for instance, those that voted for Sichel or that abandoned the candidate of the ruling coalition even before the first round, but he's tapping into a segment of voters that is increasingly concerned about issues like security and immigration, regardless of their position in the ideological spectrum. And in that sense, his profile is also quite similar to that of some leaders in the region and beyond. We have seen these issues such as the provision of social services, security, and also the economy that are that remain at the top of voters' concerns. And then campaigning is also going to matter because really both Boric and Caz have the tools to win the election. We have seen so far both candidates trying to appeal to moderate voters, incorporating new advisors, and also adjusting their plans somewhat. This is also going to matter quite significantly for the post-election outlook. The composition of Congress points to a great deal of compromise under the next administration. The Constituent Convention is more aligned with Boric's pledge to increase the role of the state and its safety net, but he would lack a majority in the Senate, and as a result, if elected, he will have to negotiate both with center-left lawmakers, but also opposition lawmakers in order to advance his agenda, which includes big changes in pensions, in healthcare, in education, and also an ambitious tax reform in order to fund these big reforms. This also adds to economic constraints similar to other presidents that are taking office in the region, because the current situation is very different to that of some years or decades ago. If elected, Cast is also going to face quite significant governability and social challenges. He would probably clash in some way with the Constituent Convention, which consists primarily of leftist and independent representatives. And also public discontent in Chile has remained significant. It is unlikely to subside anytime soon, and that could spill into street protests and also be further encouraged by Cast's a very conservative stance. So that on Chile. And then moving to Colombia, which is further away. Colombia is going to have elections, congressional elections and primary in March, and then the presidential election at the end of May, and a likely runoff in June. Next year's elections in Colombia, very much like other countries in the region, is going to be shaped by widespread discontent with the status quo that also preceded the pandemic, as was shown by massive demonstrations that erupted in 2019, by the distrust of President Iván Duque's administration, and this is still evident in his low approval ratings and the fact that the vast majority of people consulted in polls think that the country is heading in the wrong direction, even if it's not as high as it was, for instance, when protests erupted earlier this year in response to Duque's original tax reform proposal. We have seen leftist Gustavo Petro doing well in polls in this context. So he seems to be the candidate that is benefiting the most from this strong demand for change, and seems to be the best position to win a spot in a likely runoff in June. He's well above in voter preferences compared to other potential presidential candidates, including Sergio Fajardo, the former mayor of Medellin, Rodolfo Hernández, the former mayor of Bucaramanga, and also the ruling party candidate Oscar Iván Zuluaga, and others that may compete. He's also showed us winning in a runoff against any candidate. That was, for instance, what the poll issued yesterday by Inbamer showed. But that said, Petro's ability to win the election will very much depend on the electoral field, and the electoral field is still a work in progress. It is not going to be finalized until March. Primaries are going to take place on the 13th of March at the same time as congressional elections. He's sort of the only candidate, or the only clear candidate out there. So that could also be helping his numbers in the polls. They're still close to, or less than 6 months to the election, and there are close to 20 potential presidential candidates. So in general, the chances of Petro in a runoff will depend to a great extent on who is he facing, on that figure's ability to attract moderate voters and to also capitalize on demand for change. The closer that person is to the center, the worse for Petro, and the same, and likewise, the further from the traditional political establishment, the worse for him. Other candidates that could prove competitive include Fajardo, Hernández. The ruling coalition candidate, Oscar Iván Zuluaga, will probably struggle because of his association with an unpopular administration, and also sort of like traditional political establishment, but we are going to see more figures and coalitions basically working towards the election or of more figures in the coming months. Similar to Chile, if Petro is elected, that would certainly mark a departure from the policy framework that has been embraced by Duque and previous administrations. So he would seek to increase the role of the state and public spending. He would seek to limit extractive activities, which is remain a key source of government revenue. But he will also face economic constraints and probably the lack of a majority in Congress. Again, congressional elections are going to take place at the same time of the primaries. I'll stop here and move to, so that we can move to Brazil, and happy to address any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. Chris, if you could tell us a bit what you're seeing in terms of political scenario in Brazil next year, very difficult year.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here on a panel moderated by you, Patricia, and with my colleague Maria Luisa and Cliff Young, that we've worked on a number of projects together. What I would kind of make three broad points when looking at the outlook for Brazil in 2022. The first is, when we look at the Brazilian election next year, I do think that there is a consistency in the trends that we're seeing in the region, which is a trend for a significant desire and high demand for change, right? Cliff will talk about a lot of the good work that Ipsos has done, for polling in Latin America. But one of the things that they've always pointed out is that the desire and discontent with the kind of the so-called political establishment, the quality of public services was already very high in Brazil prior to the pandemic. You look at kind of how Brazil is emerging out of the pandemic, a lot of these voter demands and concerns and frustrations have been exacerbated. We're headed into a potentially very challenging economic year in 2022. Brazil is dealing with an inflationary shock. The central bank is responding by raising interest rates. Basic income has been squeezed with higher inflation. And as a result, voters are entering the 2022 election cycle with a great deal of frustration. So that does not bode well for the incumbent and Jair Bolsonaro to get reelected. He's not out of the race. We're 10 months away. We have to see what the economic outlook, how it will unfold next year. But I would say, given his levels of approval ratings right now that stand around 30%, and the economic challenges ahead, odds are that he probably won't get reelected. That's number one. Number two, the next question which many times arises is, if Bolsonaro is unlikely to get elected, how do we think about the odds of a third-party candidate? That some of them, at least you look at, former Judge Sergio Moro on the one hand, the governor of São Paulo, João Doria on the other. What are their chances of potentially making it to a runoff that will most likely, highly likely, have former President Lula from the Workers' Party in a runoff? And here I would say that even though the president enters humbled in 2022, at least the comparative work that we've done at Eurasia Group suggests that he still has a pretty good chance of making it to a runoff. Incumbents do have structural advantages when they run for re-election. We gathered a database of 226 elections worldwide in an analogous situation of what we're going to have in Brazil next year, which is a president running for re-election in a two runoff vote system, right? We gathered elections both in Latin America and Europe and Asia and Africa. We looked at municipal elections in Brazil since the re-election rule in 1997 and gubernatorial elections. And of these 226 elections, in only 7% of cases did an incumbent running for re-election not make it to a runoff. In other words, it's a rare event if we were to have Bolsonaro not making it to a runoff, given the advantages of the incumbency. Now, we're in extraordinary times. Brazil could face a recession next year. We have a potential third wave of COVID-19. The odds of Bolsonaro not making it to a runoff are higher than 7 for sure, right? But even amongst governments and incumbents with similar levels of approval ratings to the president, in at least 70% of cases, they make it to a runoff. So that means to us that for Bolsonaro not to make it, you're going to have something that will bring him down further in his levels of approval ratings. If that doesn't happen, we're probably going to have Lula and Bolsonaro in a runoff. And finally, what I would say is that when we look at kind of, the types of issues that voters care about heading into 2022, what we're seeing is that in comparison to the pre-pandemic environment where corruption was a top concern of voters, at least next to jobs and some of the quality of public services like health and security. This time around, you look at the snapshot of the issues that voters care about in Brazil, it's really, for right now, all about jobs and income, right? And corruption is less important than it was prior to the pandemic. There's a lot of open questions over what are the attributes that voters care about. But you got to think through which are the candidates that are more credible on the main issue that voters care about. And here I think Lula has a powerful message to deliver, right? He'll make the case in this campaign that he delivered jobs and income when he was president, that he lifted families out of poverty, and that he can do so again. It will be a campaign where he will be promising more spending to address the acute drop in income that we've seen for low-income families. Both Bolsonaro on the one hand and third-party candidates on the other will be criticizing former President Lula and saying that no. In fact, they'll try to remind voters of the disastrous end of the PT administration with former President Dilma Rousseff, make the case that it was corruption that helped drive a recession, and therefore he doesn't have credibility on jobs and income. But at least the starting point of Lula is a favorable one, given the associations with his previous government. So you kind of look at right now, the challenges of Bolsonaro to get reelected, the issues that voters care about, but the fact that he still is in a relatively decent position to make it to a runoff. Our preliminary view for the 2022 elections is that Lula is favored. We don't have probabilities around that yet. A lot will depend upon what happens in the economy over the next 6 to 8 months. So we don't have a lot of conviction, but our initial assessment, looking at the challenges and the desire for change, is that Lula looks favored in this election.
Thank you so much, Chris. Interesting research, interesting insights, and it's still months away, the election. So much could happen, as you just said. And Cliff, as Chris mentioned, Ipsos has done a lot of polling during the pandemic in emerging market economies and industrialized economies. Are there any trends that you can detect emerging in Latin America post-COVID-19, which could shed light on upcoming elections in Chile, Colombia, and Brazil? And what kind of demands do you see arising among voters?
Thanks a lot, Patricia. And it's great to be here. Thanks for the invite. I have 3 points as well, Chris. The first one is based upon global polling that we do, tracking polling over time. And what I can say is, as much as things are different, they're still the same. And per Chris's point, what we find globally, what we find in Latin America generally, and what we find in these 3 countries is that there's a strong desire for anti-establishment candidates and policies. There is a supermajority belief in these countries and really globally that the establishment is not working for the average person, that the traditional parties and politicians no longer care about the average person, that the system is rigged against, once again, the average person. And this is very, very important. This predates COVID. This really set up things about the time of Brexit that which led into the Trump victory. And after that, we saw a whole host of anti-establishment victories in elections across the world. This is still here. It's a very stable belief system that's really conditioning politics and still will condition politics into the near term. Obviously, anti-establishment candidates don't always win. In the case of the United States, obviously, we had an establishment candidate in Biden that won. They're not always from the right, they're from the left as well. It's really important to emphasize this. We see in Chile today, Really, you could classify both those candidates as being anti-establishment, one on the right, one on the left. It's not to say that these sorts of candidates always win. As I was saying before, they don't. But we should understand that the context is this, and we should put all of these elections within that context. The second point, which I think that Maria Lucia brought up initially, and Chris kind of alluded to, it's a change election season. Throw the bums out, throw the bums out, throw the bums out. That doesn't mean it's going to happen everywhere, but it's definitely a scenario where the incumbent or the incumbent party is at risk. That can be a function of the economy. That can be a function of COVID. That could be a function of corruption. It could be a function of many things. And it varies from country to country, but across the board, we're seeing that, not just in Latin America, but generally speaking. And here I would say the COVID caveat is that even if incumbents win, their power is attenuated. And I'll just use two examples. The example of Canada and the example of Mexico. Trudeau had a tough go, but still held the coalition. He underperformed what we all thought he was going to perform. If we looked out about a month or so, a month and a half before it. And then you take AMLO in the midterms. He underperformed, his party underperformed where we thought it was going to perform. And I would argue that these are two cases of once again, the COVID hangover, where incumbency, while strong, per Chris's point, the incumbent has structural advantages. There is an attenuation because of COVID, mostly because people are fed up with things. They're just tired of it, right? And the third point, changing agendas. Last year, it was a COVID agenda. I would say COVID, COVID, COVID. Those are the three operative words. In the United States, for instance, Biden won the election on COVID as an example. But that's changing. As COVID subsides a bit, the pandemic becomes less intense. Other issues are percolating to the front, most important which is jobs and the economy, which I think Chris mentioned. It's not just for Brazil. It's in many countries. Indeed, if you look at the global average of our global poll, jobs and the economy has now outstripped COVID as the main issue. And why is that important? Because the candidate strongest on the main issue wins the election 85% of the time. This is really something we need to look at in each of these countries. Which candidate is stronger on the main issue? Which candidate at the beginning has the intrinsic attributes that will really put him or her in front in a strong place. In Brazil, obviously, it's jobs and the economy. What we can say, based upon experience, those candidates with this strong economic manager profile tend to do better in economic scenarios. Lula, once again, just kind of at first blush, we know him very well, by the way. We've pulled on him for years, is very strong in that attribute relative to Bolsonaro. And the last point relative to a changing agenda is that when the agenda changes quickly, it tends to hurt the incumbent and the incumbent party in the short to medium term. So once again, it's one more piece of evidence that suggests that the incumbent parties or incumbent coalitions will have a problem over the next year. Thanks.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you. Thank you so much. Maria Luisa, we're in the middle of a very tight election in Chile. What are your bets on, who's likely to win? I know it's a difficult question. And about Colombia, which is a bit more, a few months away, what do you think?
Yes, in the case of Chile, our view has been for a while already that the left has an edge in this election. Boric seems to be benefiting the most from both transfers from other candidates. He is also well positioned in the sense of campaigning for more and better public spending, and we have seen that the provision of service is a key concern among voters. But the election is certainly going to be very, very competitive, and there is still room for voters fluctuation. So the share of undecided voters is still very high. The share of undecided voters, when you see specifically those who voted for other candidates in the first round, there is a great deal of people that are undecided that could end up voting for Boric, that could end up voting for Kast, or may not end up voting, right? So in a tight election, these like 1 or 2 points more or less, depending on turnout, matter. And it does matter as well, given how different is the profile of those who support Boric and those who support Kast, for instance, in terms of age, right? So young voters are primarily with Boric, older voters are primarily with Kast. So it is likely to be a tight election, right? I wouldn't be surprised if there are surprises. Colombia is a bit more tricky given that the electoral field is still wide open. So as I was mentioning, Petro is sort of like the only clear candidate that has been out there for a while. There are many coalitions, but they're still working on who is going to be the candidate of each of these coalitions. And in many cases, this is not going to be finalized only until March. So if you recall, for instance, in the 2018 election, it was only clear that Duque was going to be that candidate after March, and then evident that he was likely going to win the election. So what we are seeing so far is that Petro is competitive, that he will probably be more competitive than he was in 2018. And in 2018, he already made it to a runoff against Duque. That he seems to be one of the two candidates that will end up disputing the presidency in the runoff, in a runoff in June. But at the end of the story, how much, like if he's the base case, will depend on who he faces, and that is quite important given the potential capacity or not of that figure to attract and to capture voters closer to the center, and also to benefit from this demand for change, from this anti-establishment sentiment.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. So still field is quite open yet, as you said, in Colombia at least. Chris, in your opinion, what are the chances that a third-party candidate will pick up steam? Is there still time? And among the options that we're seeing now, Governor of São Paulo, João Doria, former Minister of Justice, Sérgio Moro, and Ciro Gomes, who do you think is going to turn out to be stronger?
Yeah. No, great question, Patricia. I mean, just to build upon my initial comments, I kind of laid out the reasons why I would still bet on Bolsonaro making to a runoff. The comparative data set suggests the odds are high, but we would give the odds of a third-party candidate making it to a runoff in about 1 in 5, so a 20% probability, which is kind of higher, rate of not making it than the international average. But you also have to recognize that Bolsonaro does have a pretty loyal base of support of at least 20% of the electorate, that will have a harder time abandoning him over the course of the campaign. But I would say that when looking at the odds of a third-party candidate making it, I would keep an eye much more on the types of events that could further undermine Bolsonaro's support than on what Sérgio Moro, João Doria, or Ciro Gomes could deliver in terms of a campaign and a message. I think the president needs to get further weakened. So the 20% odds, I think, reflect the consensus forecasts where we're going to be headed towards, close to zero growth, a bit under 1%. Inflation should come down from 10 to close to 5. And it probably assumes that we don't have a serious kind of third wave of COVID-19. So what I would say is that if we're headed into a more severe recession next year, if inflation surprises to the upside and doesn't come down as many economists are forecasting, and I would keep an eye on food inflation in particular, because there is a concern that the bottleneck in kind of production of fertilizers and kind of we're having kind of a green inflation. And so if there's a global supply shock that can impact food prices, that could bring the president's numbers down. Or if Omicron proves to be, on the worst end of expectations, all those type of things could potentially undermine the president's numbers first, and then we would be adjusting the odds of a third-party candidate making it to a runoff higher than 20%. So that's the main focus that I would be on in terms of the odds of a third-party candidate. I think it's predicated on a bad outlook in 2022 than anything specifically they can deliver. When it comes to, of the three, which is more competitive, that's a tough question to answer. I would say that Sergio Moro starts at an advantage because he has a national name recognition. He was the hero of the Lava Jato, so he's already polling kind of in double digits. The governor of São Paulo, João Doria, he has higher negatives. He's polling about half the level of support of Sergio Moro. I don't see those numbers moving significantly in the pre-campaign period. The advantage, of course, is that João Doria is a much more experienced political operator. He has a more sophisticated marketing team around him, so he could potentially be more effective over the campaign trail in comparison to Sergio Moro, and he'll present himself as an experienced administrator in São Paulo, and what he did in São Paulo, he can replicate nationally. So I don't really have I think those two probably have higher odds than Ciro Gomes, right? But I would give them roughly equivalent odds. But if the president drops, obviously the room for both of them, one of them to rise, will be higher, and then we could potentially have voters migrate to one of those two. But I don't have a strong view over which of those two is more competitive. But I think everything depends on Bolsonaro getting weaker.
Thank you, Chris. Cliff, you talk about anti-incumbent wave, right? Voters, they have a desire for change is high. How different is it what we're seeing now and we're going to be seeing next year to the pink wave, the fact that we had several left-wing governments in the region a few years ago? What's the difference? It's anti-incumbent regardless of the ideological band. How do you see this?
Well, anti-incumbency or change elections are cyclical. And they kind of go back and forth and back and forth. And so one thing is structural. And right now, the structural situation is that we're in an anti-establishment context, and it's going to be here for a while. Throw the bums out or keep more of the same, change versus continuity is very cyclical, right? It kind of swings back and forth. And it's really not linked to the ideological persuasion of the given government or the opposition. And it just so happens that we're coming out of COVID. The economies are not doing so well, or they're all confused, right? Like consumer behavior is strange. There's inflation. Things are not like they were. And these sort of set the stage for a change scenario. And that's what we're seeing. I wanted to just sort of add to what Chris was saying. I think the one caveat I would have, I don't think Bolsonaro's base is as strong as we all think it is. And obviously, Chris and I have talked about this a lot. And I think there's a weakness there that if the economy and other things go south, per Chris's point, we have to be, we have to pay very close attention. But it might not be something we perceive right away. It might not be something we pick up in the polls. It could be very like some of the last Brazilian elections where we don't see it till the end, right near election day, when you start having strategic voting. And we've seen that a number of times. I think that we saw that last time with Aécio Neves and Maria Silva. We saw that, like she was, doing well, and all of a sudden you had sort of a shift, and that shift was perceptible and it was strong. Hopefully I got the names right. I think I did. But that sort of shift is possible, and it's difficult to detect far out, and that at least is, I would say, an error term on our assessment that we have to keep in mind, and I just wanted to emphasize that.
Just because you mentioned that, it's interesting. Do you think there are many shy Bolsonaro voters, people that are not telling the pollsters that they are going to vote for Bolsonaro? And the other thing is, how big do you think Bolsonaro's base is in terms of percentage? You've been seeing some polling, 20%, then more closer to 30%. What do you see?
I think strong, and Chris, you should jump in, but I would say it's 20. That's for now, that's the tough floor, let's say, the strong floor. I'm not a big believer in soft voters. I think really what we're talking about are confused or undecided voters. And so you might have potential Bolsonaro voters or Trump voters, for instance, that didn't know they were going to vote for someone. They haven't decided yet, and they decide right at the last second. I don't think that's the case now. I don't think it's, I think people know pretty much who he is, and you're either for him or against him. It's pretty crystallized, like it was very crystallized here in the United States. But ultimately, the strategic voting could happen, such as someone who voted for Bolsonaro over Haddad, that is the PT candidate, and they can't find themselves voting for Lula because they're part of that polarization. And they say they're going to vote for Bolsonaro, and at the last second, they jump to Moro, for instance. I think that's much more of a possibility than Bolsonaro voters hiding behind something, not telling pollsters who they are.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cliff.
So,
Chris wants to jump in?
Oh, yeah, just one follow-up, Patricia, which is what Cliff pointed to is very important, which is, the big argument, of course, for the third-party candidate is exactly what Cliff said, that come a week before the election, Bolsonaro will be in the low 20s, but polls will show Lula defeating Bolsonaro in a runoff. The third-party candidate will be in the high teens, and that other third-party candidate could potentially fare against Lula much better. And so then the Bolsonaro voters will say, well, I'm going to jump ship because I want someone to defeat Lula in a runoff, right? But here, I think it's important for us to at least put a question on the table, which is, we're going to, the assumption that any third-party candidate could defeat Lula in a runoff, I think we should treat it as an assumption, not necessarily as a certainty, right? I do believe that a third-party candidate would be more competitive against Lula. Gun to my head, I would probably say favored, right? But we have to remember that if the economic environment deteriorates further in the run-up to the election, and the concern on jobs and employment grows, that could play to Lula's favor in the campaign, in the runoff against either third-party candidate or Bolsonaro, right? So it just means that the strategic voting will also depend upon what the polls are showing over which candidate is better positioned against Lula. I do think the third-party candidate is better positioned against Lula, yes, right? But it's just a reminder that the profile of what happens economically and what candidates are best aligned to the main issues, right, will be absolutely critically important as well in defining how the potential for strategic voting in the first place.
Can I ask a question to Chris? I know we're inverting the logic, but would you say right today that Lula has the ideal profile, the optimal profile, given the economic scenario that we're going to find ourselves in?
I think so, Cliff. It's obviously, and better than I do, that we're going to have to look at the rank order of concerns next year. So this is just the first snapshot as the COVID dust is starting to settle. But Lula's liabilities look smaller because corruption is not as important to voters. And the issues that voters care about are aligned with his strengths. Now, of course, that will be an issue for the campaign. And, the candidates will try to associate Lula with Dilma. But I do think that his assets are aligned with what voters seem to be caring about today, right? But we'll have to see that next year more rigorously, of course.
I want to ask something to Maria Luisa, but before I just wanted to, just because you said something, Chris, considering this and considering the economic realities that the next president in Brazil is going to face, how important is it that Lula for him to present an, economic advisor or some sort of economic policy? Because we are seeing Dória has already presented Henrique Meirelles, the former central bank president. You have Pastori with Moro. So
yeah, I don't think it's important for Lula to present who his chief economic advisor will be or his future minister of economy. In fact, I think that what I see is likely from campaign strategy is to not announce that name before the election. Have a campaign promising more spending, to get rid of the spending cap, to be able to address these social needs. And then you choose your minister of economy after you know what economic environment you're going to face. I don't think it hurts them electorally. But what the PT campaign will do is that I think that Lula will try to present an image of moderation and a national unity candidate that can unite the country against the Bolsonaro government that divided the country. That's going to be the narrative of the PT, and the vice presidential choice, I think, will serve that function. And that's why I think that the former president Lula is giving signals that he wants to have Geraldo Alckmin on his ticket. So in other words, it's a signal of political moderation, but not necessarily anchoring expectations from an economic program and a fiscal point of view. So I do think that we're headed into a campaign cycle where fiscal expectations may be unanchored because of that. If we have a moderation on economic policy, it will be after the election, not pre-election.
Perfect. Maria Luisa, beyond the elections in Chile, I mean, we saw in the last few years social instability, issues that are really sensitive and that the next president is going to have to deal with. What do you see beyond the elections?
Yeah, so I would say that I mean, to begin with, there is a process ongoing to rewrite the constitution. So basically, when protests erupted in 2019, the government responded both by significantly expanding fiscal spending and also embarking in a process to rewrite the constitution. That process has already begun. The Constituent Convention began sessions in July. It has already set its guidelines, its procedures for going forward, and started debating sort of like the substance of the new constitution, because there's still a great deal of uncertainty as to how the new constitution will look like, right? And that very much depends on the final wording, despite the fact that there seems to be overall agreement on some trends. To expand the role of the state, to provide a more welfare, so more on pensions, on healthcare, on education, more environmental protection, more indigenous rights recognition. So the next president is going to inherit that process. The new constitution should be ready by mid-2022. It is then going to be submitted for ratification in a referendum, and it will probably need as well that some pieces of legislation be adapted to whatever is eventually put and written in there. So that number one. Number two, I would say that this continued pressure, social pressure for more spending is unlikely to subside anytime soon. That, coupled with a new constitution that will probably be more generous, will mean that the next president is going to inherit a quite difficult fiscal situation. So if you see Chile, it clearly started the pandemic in a much better fiscal position than many countries, most countries in Latin America. But levels of spending have increased a lot, and even though there is a plan for that to be reduced after the pandemic, the projections of debt levels depend very much on which is the next government that is elected and what is in the final constitution. So that trend is for more spending to probably continue, and therefore there is going to be the need for increasing revenue in order to attend these social demands. And then finally, I would mention the need for agreement and the need for consensus. So congressional elections already took place. No one is going to have a majority in the Senate. So that means that if Boric is elected or if Cast is elected, they will need to negotiate with the opposition and reach some sort of agreement in order to advance their agenda. So we have seen already that both candidates trying to moderate a bit, trying to appeal more moderate voters. So I guess that in that sense, in Chile, as was the case in Peru, for instance, there has been a bit of at least a bit of a change in comparison with the run-up to the first round and the run-up to the second round in order to attract more moderate voters. But that need for consensus and agreement is definitely going to be needed given the institutional constraints, the lack of a majority in Congress, in addition to the economic constraints that we have already been talking about.
Perfect. Cliff, what do you think in the most likely scenario that you have former President Lula running against President Bolsonaro next year? How likely is it that Brazil is going to end up in a very fractured environment, a very polarized environment, even more than it is today, just like here in the US, where, you know, former President Trump still has a lot of influence, political clout. So is Brazil doomed for, you know, this really, really strong polarization after the elections?
You know, I don't know if you're going to have, you know, people storming Congress, but I do think it'll be as polarized, probably more polarized than it is today, because that's the trend globally, right? One of the functions of this, you know, the surge of anti-establishment beliefs is the reinforcement of a very polarized environment. And indeed, and we already had polarization in Brazil, and this has been going on over the last 20 years. We've seen it increasingly so, as there was a very kind of binary choice between, you know, the PT and the PT and the PSDB. That's changed a bit. And what that's been replaced by is kind of a deinstitutionalization of politics, and Bolsonaro represents that. And that 20% that we talked about shouldn't be downplayed. That's 20% of the Brazilian population. That's a lot of people, right? Obviously, it's not probably as large as Trump's base, which is in the 30s, but it's still significant. The ferocity of the reaction, let's say, post-election, we'll see. Let's assume that Bolsonaro doesn't win. That's a question mark, but I would say we should expect greater uncertainty rather than lesser uncertainty around that. They've already started talking about the illegitimacy of elections, which is interesting. Obviously, in Brazil, there is a additional institutional safeguard in the fact that the election courts are separate, very different than in the United States, for instance. But I think we should all expect increased polarization coming out of the election, not decreased.
Thank you. I just wanted to remind you in the audience, because you can send questions in the chat box if you have any questions, and Chris and Cliff and Maria Luisa are going to answer. Chris, I mean, you were telling us about your projections, the most likely outcome of the elections next year. The government has been, Brazilian government has been finding ways to increase fiscal spending. You know, just the spending limitations were basically eliminated in some cases. How is there a possibility that there's a lot of, you know, massive cash transfer campaign, including Auxílio Brasil, but other programs that might alleviate this feeling, this malaise among voters today because of inflation and loss of income? I mean, could that be strong enough to impact President Bolsonaro's chances?
Yeah, no, good question, Patricia. I think the answer is probably no. And let's look at the net impact of the president's decision to change how the spending cap is calculated in a manner that would open room for more spending to fund this new social welfare program, Auxílio Brasil, of a minimum 400 reais benefit per family, right? Where the economic team was planning to deliver something closer to 300. The very decision to open the room for more spending, it ended up weakening the currency, unanchoring expectations. It made the central bank more worried over its capacity to control inflation. And so the response to larger fiscal uncertainties was to have a more aggressive tightening cycle of interest rates, which that in and of itself is lowering the potential for growth in 2022. So if you ask the question, the government's decision to increase its cash transfer program, was that a net positive or a net negative for the president? It probably will end up being a net negative, even though you are compensating partially, the concerns for low-income families. So I would probably say there's a similar, let's say, takeaway if in 2022 the administration tries to engage in additional rounds of spending. I would say it's unlikely that they will try meaningfully or will be able to, because you would probably have to have another constitutional amendment to be able to provide additional spending above and beyond the new spending cap, which was just approved in the Senate and also is likely to ratify in the lower house. The big caveat is the COVID variant. If Omicron, starts to be more serious and we have a new wave of infections, hospitalizations, then the administration could consider additional rounds of spending to provide relief to low-income families on an extraordinary basis. And then we're going to be in this very hazy middle ground where, what is the requisite to be able to provide fiscal relief in a third wave of the pandemic that may not be as severe as the first two waves, right? And that's kind of where we may very well have noise and concerns, but I don't think, I don't think it will be a game changer for the election, to be quite honest. I think that the election depends on, actually inflation coming down, which means the currency being stable, which will lower gasoline and diesel and diesel fuel prices, and food inflation. So I would really be looking at inflation, the capacity to control inflation, much more than the potential for the government to spend. And if the government spends irresponsibly, it'll undermine its ability to control inflation. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Thank you, Chris. Maria Luisa, we have a question from the audience, from Álvaro Ribanco, NetWest. It's the same question for Chile. He's saying, are there any, in your opinion, shy caste voters, especially those who voted for Parisi in the first round? Is it possible that it's been underestimated, the share of voting that he's likely going to get?
It is certainly possible. When after the first round, when we tried to do like a bit of the math of where the votes for each of the candidates would go, we assumed that a bit more than 40%, or even like between 40 or 50% of those who voted for Parisi would end up voting for Kast. What we have seen recently is that apparently those who voted for Parisi are really split, and actually Boric seems to be benefiting the most from the transfer of vote. But then again, there is a still significant share of undecided voters among those who voted for Parisi. So this is really a big question mark, because even those that are saying that will either vote for Kast or for Boric from among Parisi's voters could end up not voting, and this adds to a still large share of voters that are undecided within Parisi's voters. So my guess is that it's probably going to be split, and there is going to be a significant share that abstains.
Perfect. Cliff, you were saying that the economy is one of the main issues that is mobilizing voters, and income and inflation and all that. Considering that many of the countries in the region had to do a lot of fiscal spending because of COVID pandemic, several of them, including Brazil, are in a poor fiscal position, and there's not gonna be much space for economic policy or to fiscal spending and to distributing goods to voters after the election, whoever wins the election. How do you see the scenario that you're going to end up having countries that are facing difficult economic situation and voters who were really unhappy about the economic situation?
Well, I think that the question just goes to one of the initial points we made, which is it's a change scenario. And by the way, it's a change scenario, not just in Latin America, but in general. That doesn't mean the opposition or opposition candidates or parties will necessarily win, but they have a greater likelihood. And I just kind of like as an addendum to that, we do a lot of analysis of consumer behavior as well. And what we saw was with the stimulus interventions, that is the cash transfers, not just in Latin America, but we've looked at in other countries, including the United States, is that really bolstered during the peak months of COVID, not just household consumption, but optimism as well. So a lot of the numbers we saw in terms of approval ratings didn't take a huge hit, in part why? Because households were cash rich. And increasingly, they're not so anymore, right? They're spending the money. In some cases, they're going crazy. In other cases, they're taking it and deleveraging their debt, that is household debt, and they're saving it in the cases of more affluent and higher income consumers. But there's going to be a hangover from that. And we're already seeing it sort of in the optimism numbers that we track, kind of the linkage between the two, that there's more uncertainty about what will happen. There's increasing uncertainty about whether they're going to have a job in 6 months, and just generalized uncertainty. Why? Because COVID's not going away, and so the expectation that we all will go back to normal keeps on being pushed out for people. That's what people are doing. Where am I going with this? That consumer behavior and sort of the consequences of COVID, there's a hangover from that. More generally, from a macro standpoint, as already pointed out, governments are in a strapped position. They will not be able to necessarily pump prime the economies. This all goes to bad news for incumbents individuals, governments, as well as incumbent parties.
Okay. Chris, I'm not sure if you want to add to that. I mean, as Cliff said, there might be a hangover, and some people who are benefiting from generous stimulus packages will no longer be, or are going to have more modest ones, like in Brazil. And there's the phenomenon of inflation, spreading.
Yeah, no, and I think that we did see this. I mean, I think we saw the same trend in the three countries that we're talking about in Latin America, right? We had kind of, let's say, voters reacting positively to the fiscal, cash transfer programs. In the case of Chile and Colombia, the initial responses to the pandemic were seen favorably. And then the kind of that bump of the first year was dissipated in year two and attenuated and exacerbated by this issue of kind of inflation, which I think is particularly acute for low income families because food inflation was higher than the average inflation. And also the impact of, in the Brazilian case, we had increases in gasoline and diesel prices, which were 30 to 40%. So in other words, the income transfer that looked reasonable in year one looks less reasonable from a purchasing power parity in year two. And that's why, the challenges going forward are going to be so acute. We're going to have a difficult environment for incumbents. And in the Brazilian case, we're headed into an election where the fiscal anchor, at least fiscal policy, is unanchored with the changes to the spending cap. So whoever wins post-election will have to re-anchor expectations on a new spending rule, but with still large social demands. And so how you can reconcile the two will be a significant challenge. And so governments that have more difficult trade-offs, we're going to have a tougher challenge. Other governments that have a lower debt burden, lower tax burden, can probably reconcile the two by increasing taxes. And that's probably where we're headed in Chile. In Brazil, for you to increase taxes to accommodate more spending is a higher opportunity cost because you already have a very high tax burden. So the policy trade-offs, I think, are tougher in the Brazilian case post-election in comparison to some other countries in Latin America.
So basically all the presidents incoming presidents have a very tough job ahead in all these countries. I'm sure we have so many other questions and we would be here talking for hours, but unfortunately our time is up. I want to thank you, Maria Luisa and Cliff and Chris, and thank you everybody in the audience who was watching us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.